Hello everybody. A few days ago I saw a chuck roast at my local grocery store and thought to myself that I could cook it like a steak. I was surprised by the results, so I wanted to share my process with you. Quality is always important with food, but finding an equilibrium between price and quality I think supersedes the quality factor alone. I had a little extra money in my pocket, so I gifted myself a grass-fed, grass-finished chuck roast cut. I found out that the difference between grass-fed and grass-finished is literally in the title. One would assume that grass-fed means that the cow was eating grass its whole life, but unfortunately grass-fed does not cover the final year or months of the cow's life before slaughter. This is when the cattle are fed a grain diet to increase fat content to get the farmer a better deal on the market. As you can see, it does not have too much intramuscular fat when compared to similar chuck roasts you would find at the store. With the fact that fat carries flavor before cooking, I assumed that I would have to find the perfect sweet spot for the seasoning and the butter basting. But now, onto the cooking process. I first start out by dry brining the steak with salt overnight for at least 24 hours. To me, this draws out the moisture along with breaking down the fat proteins in the cut, tenderizing the meat. I think that drawing out the moisture allows it to be rehydrated with whichever content you are cooking it in. So in my case, it would reabsorb my compound butter and the aromatic herbs I basted it in while cooking. I made sure to let it brine on a baking rack so air can penetrate both sides and so that the moisture that escapes as a liquid will be caught in a baking sheet. For the compound butter, the herbs I included were green onion, sage, rosemary, mint, and thyme. I think these all blend together for a unique savory flavor that works extremely well with beef proteins. I try not to chop them up too much on the cutting board because the oils from the herbs I think are lost with fine cutting. Once the herbs are prepared, I add room temperature butter into a bowl followed by the herbs. I then work them all together until it becomes a unanimous mixture. Once it becomes the right green hue I'm looking for, the compound butter is complete. I normally just eyeball the amounts and goes with what feels right. With this in mind, it is important to remember that with cooking, you can always add more but never take away. Another method I have tried once but need more practice with is blending the herbs with the butter in the blender. This way all the oils go right into the butter. The only thing is you need a strong blender that will be able to fully incorporate the herbs within the butter or you could get chunks. Definitely worth the try though. I find the mixing part to be the best part because you get to taste the butter and get a wrist workout. I thoroughly enjoy the flavor, so this is fun to me. If you plan on topping the steak with this butter, I would recommend putting it in a cellophane wrap to create that butter log, or just keep it in the bowl if you're planning on using it only to baste. And once it becomes the right green hue I'm looking for, the compound butter is complete. When I cook steaks, I tend to reverse sear them in the oven. So what this means is I preset the oven to 250 degrees and bake the steak in there for about 5 to 10 minutes or until the internal temperature reaches 90 to 100 degrees. Since this is a thicker cut, it did take quite some extra time to reach that temperature. But once it reaches, like I said, anywhere from between 90 to 100 degrees, it's ready for the perfect sear. One thing I would recommend is that you use ghee when you're searing steaks. So what ghee is it's clarified butter, and clarified butter has a smoke point of about 500 degrees. And with this comes a roaring hot pan, which can sear steaks perfectly. One downside to this is the amount of smoke that it can create. So I would recommend opening up windows and turning on a fan. So for me, I seared it on both sides for about 2 minutes, and I also got the opposite sides. For example, fat caps on the ribeye, but this one didn't have any. Once I was done with that, I pulled the steak out and let it rest for a little bit while I drained the ghee. I then threw in the compound butter that I made and also some aromatics. These aromatics included rosemary, thyme, and cracked garlic cloves. Once the butter began to bubble, I then threw the steak back in and I started the basting process. The butter got absorbed extremely quickly as expected, and I wish I made it with 2 sticks. but it turned out pretty well. One thing that I do have to mention is it is extremely heavy. The chuck roast itself is only 2 pounds, but you have to angle it to get all that butter to go to the opposite side of the pan and to flick it over. So the wrist work was extreme. But again, it's definitely worth it because it turns out to hold all that flavor of the butter, and that's what we're going for.
On top or?
Yeah.
Can I get a good picture of your husband? So good. You want to keep going?
I'm gonna get a temp read.
When the internal temp reads about 115 to 120, this is when I tend to pull the steak. The reason why I pull it at about 115 to 120 is that when you're letting the steak rest for about 10 minutes, it is still cooking, so the internal temperature still increases. For this chuck roast, I did pour the oils on top, which I normally do, and you should normally do too, but I also cover it with a tinfoil tent. This is again just to keep the heat and moisture trapped inside. So imagine a steak in a sauna just sitting there marinating. After the time is up, it is then time to cut. With this steak, once I cut into it, I realized that I did leave it on a bit too long. I should have done about a minute 45 to a minute 30 on each side and basted it for a shorter amount of time. The steak itself came to a pretty decent medium. Like I said, I could have done better if I cooked it for a little bit shorter time, but that information about grass-finished beef wasn't told to me until much later. Anyways, this is just me cutting the steak, and I'll just let you guys watch. Well, there you guys have it, a chuck roast cooked like a steak. How do you guys think I did? I think I did pretty well for my first time. I'll more than likely try this again because I'm a big fan of steak. See you guys later.